All right, let's talk a little bit about groups, and let's start off by just addressing, some of the basic features of groups. Now, you might think, we all know what a group is. Why are you defining this? But I think it's important to think about a group being, more than one person, right? And really, for our definition of what we mean by a group, they're somehow interdependent. They are, for some reason, connected to each other to some degree. So, for example, I wouldn't necessarily call people who are shopping at the local Safeway, not the ones who are lined up. I'm not going to say the ones who are lined up to pay. I'm talking about the ones who are in the aisle shopping. I wouldn't necessarily call them a group, right? Because they aren't interdependent in any fashion. There's maybe minor moments of group-ish like behavior in the grocery store where maybe two of you are looking in the same basic area and you have to kind of figure out, which one of you gets to pick your cereal first or whatever. But for the most part, that's just a bunch of people at the grocery store. What we're going to be interested in is actual groups where people are somehow interdependent, interrelated. Typically, a group is what we would consider in social psychology to be a group would be people who have regular face-to-face contact. So again, that's why my shoppers at Safeway don't really fit the category, because it's not like everybody agrees, okay, these are all the people who shop at 10 a.m. on Mondays. Like, we always see each other. Like, that's not how that works. So people who have just incidental contact, we probably wouldn't call them group members, but people who have regular contact, okay, we're going to call that a group. So some examples of groups would be, your family, in class, partners working on a presentation, at work, your coworkers, those who you spend time with and interact with, those probably constitute a group. On the other hand, things I wouldn't consider a group that are more what we call social categories would be the general category called a student, or the general category called a football player, or the general category called an adult. A lot of times in regular language, you would call these groups, but I'm just trying to distinguish for you what we mean in social psychology between a group and then this would be non-groups. These are social categories for us. And it's kind of one of the tricky parts about social psychology, because we use the English language to label things, and then a lot of our words in the English language have multiple definitions, right? So hopefully you're on the same page with me on what we mean by a group and what we don't mean by a group. All right. So, social norms. So groups tend to have their own social norms, right? Shared rules, shared expectations about how the group members should act. So, thinking about your own family, your family has its own norms about what you should and shouldn't do. When my kids were still in, I think, middle school, I mentioned to my students, this is an older story because my kids are adults now. So this was a story from like prior to 2011, but probably later than 2008. So probably right about in that region. I mentioned to my students in class that my kids weren't allowed to text. And my students were aghast. How are you controlling whether your kids text or not? And I'm like, well, I don't pay for texting on our plan. This is an old story. They don't you can't even have this option anymore, I don't think, unless you have like, I don't know, a jitterbug or something. But I was only paying for our cell phones to be cell phones back then. We didn't have the ability to text. And we had those old kind of phones that if you were going to text, you had to use the 9 keys, and it would have been a nightmare anyway. The kids probably would have figured it out, no problem. But anyway, so I didn't pay for it. So if texting showed up, I paid extra for it. So I absolutely knew which number did the texting. And so, take that kid's phone away. And my students were like, take their phone away? Oh my gosh, you're a nightmare. I told my kids that story, and they go, well, I mean, you pay for it. My kids knew they were lucky they had a freaking phone. You are so lucky you have a phone. We got it largely as a reaction to the fact that one time we dropped my daughter off for her 6 a.m. dance practice, and it had been canceled due to weather, and she didn't have a phone to call us back. But luckily, another parent showed up and let her use their phone, and we're like, okay, we can't be doing that to you anymore. Okay, you get a phone. But the idea that we had a rule, no texting, that's our family rule. Other people's families have other rules, right? And the kids know that that's their rule. Just BT dub, that lasted, I don't know, 2 years. Then, of course, the phone companies changed their pricing policy. So now texting, of course, was free. Then that lasted a couple of years. Then they changed their smartphone policies, and then we all got smartphones, and we all joined the 21st century, and just 10 years later, something. But anyway, the idea that you know what your family expects of you, you know what your coworkers expect from you, you know what your classmates expect from you if you're in a group, right? Those are those social norms. Social roles are the expectations that are placed on a person. They're supposed to play this particular role, right? So some of you might be an older sibling or a younger sibling, and you know that there are expectations that go along with that role of being the older or the younger sibling. There's a lot of stereotyping that goes on, assumptions that go on, or you might be the boy and your sibling might be the girl, or vice versa in your family. And so there are certain roles. In my family, the joke was you have to have a Y chromosome to take out the garbage. My daughter and I thought we were very clever coming up with that one, because we didn't want to take out the garbage, and we're like, we'll take out the composting. How's that for a deal? Until my daughter found a snake in the compost pile, and then my son was young enough that he was like, I'll do the composting. So my husband got stuck with the garbage. My son was doing the composting, and my daughter and I didn't have to go outside. Yay. But we all had our roles to play, right? Of course, we were doing things on the inside. We're doing the vacuuming. We're doing the dishes or whatever. And everybody was taking on whatever they were willing to do and whatever their role was. And, once you take on a task in a family, for example, everybody else kind of counts on you to do that task. And so if you lose interest in it and don't want to do it anymore, everybody else is like, I thought you were in charge of this. One of the rules I made up in our household is that we get to revisit our chore chart. Like every couple of months or every 6 months, we would revisit and say, okay, who wants to switch? Who wants to do something else? Or a new task has come on board or something like that. So we could all kind of pick things that we were willing to do and not have to be nagged about, because that's annoying. But we all know our roles, right? And it's kind of nice if everybody has taken on their role and is accepting of their role and is willing to fulfill their role. Where it's not nice is when a role has been imposed on us and it's not the role we want. That is not, and groups oftentimes do that to us. Like, somebody has to take this role, and so we've all voted and it's you. It's like, I don't want that role. Maybe we've outgrown the role and we would like to do something else. Like, one of the things as a younger child I will throw out is that as the younger child, my role was pretty much everybody thought they were supposed to teach me stuff all the time. That was my role all the time, is absorber of everybody else's knowledge. And, you get to a certain point in your life and you start to go, I've actually accumulated some knowledge that's outside of this family that is actually, maybe I could teach you something, but you still look at me like the younger child. So, sometimes we've outgrown our roles. Sometimes we don't want the role that was placed on us. But one of the things about groups is that we oftentimes realize whether we like our role or not, everybody else is depending on us. Social status is another factor. Anytime there's a group, there's going to be some kind of, status hierarchy. That's the nature of having two or more people together, is that, and it can fluctuate. Like, the person who has the authority to make a decision in one context in a group may not have the authority to make a decision in a different context. So, for example, the person whose social role within the group is the person who does the grocery shopping may have the authority to make a decision about, let's say, substitutions for buying groceries. Like, everybody asked for Pop-Tarts. They didn't have the flavor that everybody wanted, so I got this other kind. I had the authority to do that because I'm the one who does the grocery shopping, because that's the social role that was imposed on me. Or maybe I asked for it, as the fake person in my fake group that I'm describing. But I don't have the right, let's say, as the person who does the grocery shopping and can make a decision on my own on that, I don't necessarily have the right to then impose dictates on whoever's in charge of taking out the garbage or, whatever other tasks need to be done, right? I have authority in certain contexts and not in other contexts as a member of a group, right? And so we have to be really aware within our group what our limits are, and, use the authority and the prestige that we have for some tasks in the group, or some things within the group, and then other times defer to other people. a lot of times in a group, let's say a family, you have maybe one or let's say two people who are the de facto always authority figures on everything. They might be called parents. Like parents get to decide all the things, and the dependent children, they don't have that authority. They haven't reached that level of prestige where they get to make those kind of independent decisions. I always told my kids, if I'm responsible for every single thing you do, like I could be punished in addition or instead of you for things you do, I got all the risk. That's why I get to make the decisions on these things that you might think you should get to decide. I have all the risk, I have all the authority. So it is, I have to say, such a relief not to be in that position anymore. It's so great that they're adults. I don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. But anyway, the idea that, in a group, a single person may emerge as the leader and then they are always the leader is probably not as descriptive of most groups, right? Most groups, there's a lot of fluctuation and deferring in certain circumstances and taking authority on in other certain circumstances. So those are some basic features. Now, cohesiveness describes the forces that cause the members to remain in a group. So some groups are more cohesive than others. Some groups have lots of factors that cause them to stay in that group. Like a family, people tend to be pretty cohesive because, you were born into it and you have all this fidelity and loyalty, right? All these things that go along with being a member of a family. So it's difficult a lot of times to break away from your family because you're like, well, but, we're a really cohesive unit. These people made me and grew me and all those things. Whereas other groups are very, non-cohesive. They're transitory. You were placed in them randomly by your teacher for a project, that kind of thing. So cohesiveness has some positive factors and some negative factors that can contribute to cohesiveness. One positive factor that builds cohesiveness would be whether the members like each other. Another one is whether the members act effectively together. And then the other positive factor would be whether they have been successful in meeting their goals in the past. So if these things are present, we like each other, we work effectively, in the past we've been successful in meeting our goals, that contributes to greater cohesiveness. Things that can break cohesiveness are things like, the cost of leaving the group, the lack of alternatives for leaving. So these are some negative factors that contribute to cohesiveness as well. Because if it would cost me a lot to leave this group, I'd have to change everything about my lifestyle, or I'd have to move, or I wouldn't have an income anymore. Or, if there's a lot of cost associated with leaving the group, I may stay there, even though there aren't really those positive factors keeping me there. The negative factors are outweighing it. If there's no place else for me to go, if I leave this group, what group will I join? I may stay with the group that I'm in. I had to make that decision in grad school. My situation with my mentor was a little shaky. I won't go into the details. It was just a little, we'll just say unsatisfying. And so my husband at the time was urging me, well, why don't you go work in somebody else's lab? And that's just not really how it works in graduate school. You get recruited by your mentor. You're kind of committed to that person. All the other faculty members have their own graduate students. And so to be able to leave somebody's lab and go to somebody else's lab it's a big thing. I was having a lot of difficulty because the positive factors weren't really there for me staying in the lab. Members liking each other. I was the only graduate student in the lab. Everybody else was an undergraduate, and they would leave every year. Because we only took them in when they were seniors, and so they'd graduate and they'd leave. We did work effectively together, and I got to be sort of in a leadership role, but I was having a lot of difficulty with my actual mentor working effectively together. And then being successful in meeting goals, that was my big stumbling block. I was having a lot of difficulty getting projects done, getting manuscripts through publication, those factors. So, it felt like the logical thing to do would be to leave and join a different group, but I had a lack of alternatives. And there's also a cost to leaving. Now I have this stigma of leaving my mentor's lab. And, half of the people, if not more, are going to assume that it's probably my fault that I had to leave. And so it caused me to stay in his lab until I graduated. I stayed through the whole time. And so it looked like a cohesive group from the outside if you didn't know the turmoil that was going on inside of me. But there was so much negative associated with trying to leave that it caused me not to leave. All right. So one of the things I like to do in the actual class is to do the Lost on the Moon demonstration, and I'll bet a lot of you guys have seen something like this, where you're put into this so-called survival situation and you're supposed to solve the problem. I've given you something to do that's sort of like this. In case you've seen this one, I give you something sort of like this for your discussion. So let's go ahead and take a break here, knowing that you guys get to do something in your discussion that's kind of similar, and we will pick up in the next one. I'm not doing this. I'm talking about group activities. So I will see you in the next segment.